Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. I've greeted you in Māori, the language of the Indigenous people of New Zealand, as a mark of my respect. I'm presenting on my own, but there is a fantastic team that work with me, and I would like to acknowledge them up front, whose input into this presentation I really appreciate. Kyle Matthews, Joanna Kidman, Jude Sligo, and Carissa Shoden. Many emotions fuel activism: anger, love, frustration, hope, despair, optimism. Emotions act as our guides in the work of social change in positive and negative ways. As we progress through our research, we registered emotional responses at every turn as activists spoke of and demonstrated the centrality of emotions to their work. Anger highlights injustices for us, motivating our action. Hope tells us that we can, in conjunction with others, bring about change. Love guides our work in the collectives that result and the relationships that we form. We feel optimism at what is possible and frustration at the slow pace of change. When the work becomes too hard and the rewards too infrequent, we despair and sometimes burn out. There was no one emotion that was the driving force. Often the full emotional repertoire was in play. As one of our research participants said, maybe it's a bit of hope and a bit of anger and a bit of sadness, all in this one weird emotion of wanting the world to be better. We use emotions as shorthand for indicating the inner lives of activists, encompassing feelings, ethical and political ideals, and the ways emotions and ideals motivate activists to intervene in injustice to create change. We're talking about activism for social justice. The 6 groups in our study were recruited because they are addressing climate change, Indigenous rights, feminist and queer rights, and social and economic justice. We wanted to find out what inspires and sustains their activism. All groups agreed to be named, and their website banners are displayed behind me. I will mainly talk about the climate action group, Generation Zero, whose vision is a zero carbon economy. Some participants agreed for their names to be used, others wanted code names, and we do not distinguish between them. Hope was important and seemed to fulfil many functions. It encapsulated the possibility of change, was necessary, motivating and sustaining of individuals and groups. It incorporated the positive, galvanising emotions of activists, and also operated as a collectivising force that created a sense of solidarity and community. But hope can also be scarce and unevenly distributed, and the socio-economic inequalities due to 35 years of neoliberal policies in New Zealand have corresponded with inequalities in the distribution of hope. It's hard to be hopeful if your prospects seem limited, or if there's a general sense of hopelessness within your family, neighbourhood, and the wider community. Neoliberal governments, and for that matter, military dictatorships, limit activism to maintain the status quo, sometimes brutally, as we are currently witnessing in Myanmar. In New Zealand's neoliberal context, activism gets managed by police and government in particular kinds of ways. Activism such as the school strike for climate marches are okay, but protests against coal mining are handled differently because they disrupt business as usual. And Kyle Matthews, who is on the team, is doing his PhD about this, so watch out for his work. A pervasive, haunting sense of hopelessness and despair about whether climate change would be addressed in time was noticeable across the 6 groups. Although I'm going to focus more on climate action in this presentation, the groups in our study working on intractable issues such as colonisation and sexual violence also felt hopeless about progress. Colonisation is a big part of the story of climate change, which we've written about in an article published in Time and Society. And to address any one of these, climate change, colonisation is big. And if hope for progress on any of these is so unlikely, then it's remarkable that so many activists in our study sustain their activism on these fronts. Even if a group didn't work directly on climate change, they identified their despair, anger and worry about government inaction on climate change.
You don't see things changing very quickly, and my belief in institutions is kind of fading as that doesn't happen. So just trying to get your head around that and still be active.
There was hope in the work of activism and feeling like change is possible with the passing of the Zero Carbon Act, but there was a more general lack of hope in the likelihood and speed of change. Carrying the emotional weight of a cause you care deeply about and at the same time living with the existential threat of climate change is a heavy burden.
I used to be a lot more optimistic, especially when I was first coming into contact with feminism and queer activism and decolonialism and all of these things. I was a lot more hopeful. My generation, we've grown up in a world where climate change has been like a pertinent issue at the forefront of our minds since we were young. And in that way, this is going to sound really dramatic, but it feels a bit apocalyptic in a way. I've actually been reflecting on that a lot recently, because I think it's getting me down, quite a bit. I feel a lot more cynical than I used to, and I'm not a cynical person. I'm really not. I'm quite an optimist.
We all understand that reading scary climate change news too often can be quite detrimental to our mental health. And we're also quite aware that we need to talk about it, and not just store it or repress it, but talk about it in a healthy way.
Generation Zero hold annual conferences and more recently started including workshops on identifying and avoiding burnout. The emphasis was on paying attention to stress and challenging burnout as something climate and other activists take for granted. Strategies were recommended by experienced members, the key one being to reassure anyone unable to do what they volunteered to do that it was okay. I attended one of the Generation Zero annual conferences and one evening talked with two young women who had sought counselling because they felt so overwhelmed by the threat of climate change. One of them laughed in an ironic tone as she recounted how the counsellor suggested writing a worry list, which completely ignored the scale of her worry. This morphed into a tearful talk about all the implications of a future that's shit and whether it's worth individuals making changes. I was left wondering about Generation Zero's strategy of positive messaging and emphasis on solutions to avoid the doom and gloom, and wondered where there was space for despair and grief. This is a presentation in two parts. To summarise this far, I have acknowledged a pervasive sense of hopelessness amongst New Zealand activists about whether climate change will be addressed in time. In part two, I will consider how this realistic assessment of the obstacles to climate action are an important part of what Victoria McGeer describes as hoping well. See you again soon.